My name's Steve Hazard. I'm 70 years old now. I was in the United States Air Force from 1965 to 1969. I enlisted in the Air Force as opposed to being drafted into the Army. It was a choice that I made and one that I never regretted. I went to Lackland Air Force Base in Texas in the middle of summer. That was my basic training. From there, I went to Chanute Air Force Base in Rantoul, Illinois, and I trained to be a crew chief on a 141 aircraft. It's a big cargo plane. You may recognize it by the big T tail it had on the back. It looked like a T. After a few months as a flight engineer on a 141, I was asked if I wanted to become a flight engineer, which was flying pay and a couple other advantages. I got to see the world. So yes, I decided to opt for that. I I went to school in Oklahoma City, Tinker Air Force Base, to learn how to be a flight engineer. After that, I was pretty much stationed in California. During my time, I went to 44 different countries, flew all over the world, Europe, Asia, and just about all over. Was in and out of Vietnam quite a bit, because that was obviously during the Vietnam era. We basically took cargo into Vietnam, and on occasion we would bring home soldiers that had passed away. We would bring them back to the States for burial. The only danger I ever encountered were going in and out of the air bases of Vietnam. We would encounter some ground fire, and for the most part it did very little damage, but they would hit the plane and just make little bullet holes in the plane. But for some reason, whether our youth or otherwise, but it didn't seem like a real threat to us, but I guess in hindsight it could have been. During the free time, it was unlike some of the other branches of the service. In the Air Force, it was, for the most part, a 9-to-5 job in the Air Force if you were stationed stateside during a relatively routine job. Being on flying status, it was unique in as we would fly for maybe 10, 12, 15 days, and when we got back, we would take off that amount of time, 10, 12 days. So during that time, it was just like anything else. I lived in a community. I lived in San Bernardino, California. I lived there with my wife at the time. And you just lived a normal life. You went out to eat, you went shopping, you did whatever a family does, go on picnics, things like that. When you were flying, you were gone for 2 weeks or sometimes longer. Communicating with the folks back home, my parents and things like that, it was a lot different back in those days. We didn't have cell phones, we didn't have text messaging, or so many things, FaceTime, none of that existed. So we would, and to make long distance calls actually cost money. So we could call on military lines. You had to schedule a time, and you might have 3 or 4 or 5 minutes in which you could talk home on a watch line, they called it. And you would go to an appointed place where they had 4 or 5 phones, and you would wait in line for your turn. And then you would call home, and you got to talk to your parents and your siblings and tell them what was going on. But it was an entirely different world back then in the 60s than it is today. When I got out of the service, you hear a lot today about some of the protests and some of the anger at the war in Vietnam. My experience was somewhat different. There were certainly protests that existed. People were unhappy with the war. But there was likewise a lot of people that were not unhappy with the war. And I think as time went on, it became kind of skewed where people think everybody in the world was against the Vietnam War. And in fact, maybe today they are. But back then, it was probably more like a 50-50 thing. Now, again, this is my personal experience. But there was quite a few people that understood the war. They thought it was a noble thing. And these were the people that I kind of interacted with. So when I got out of the military, I did not, again, I saw it on the news, but I did not personally get involved in any of the protests or people protesting me. It just didn't exist in my life. It was just something that you saw on the 6 o'clock news.